Hello everyone, this is Cabane the Christian, and this is the third part of my series on my journey of faith. What it looks like now is that there's going to be four parts, and this part is going to deal with my conversion to Orthodoxy, and I think it's going to go through 4 years, from 2009 to 2013. Um, so where we left off, I had a conversation with an internet friend of mine, and he spoke to me about Orthodoxy and suggested to me that it might actually make a difference if a person converted to Orthodoxy or not, which was the first challenge that I had to a kind of very low church evangelical view of what the nature of the church was. Well, this troubled me for about a day, but eventually I set it to the back of my mind. And what I also mentioned is that at this point in my life, I don't really know what caused it, but I started to pray. Not very much, not ordered prayer, but spontaneously, I actually began to pray to God um, about issues that I was having in terms of sin, in terms of arrogance, etc. Now, at this point in my life, I have to say that I was largely in denial that I had a sin problem. Um, I could invent ways easily of justifying everything that I did. And I did invent them. And I was not a pleasant person to be around, and I know that because people have told me in hindsight, people I knew in person, not just on YouTube, that I was not pleasant to be around. And I was a jerk and very selfish. Um, anyway, over the summer, I did some reading just on apologetics, what I'd kind of been doing. And in July, while I was up in Maine, I made a Facebook status about bad Protestant arguments against purgatory and about how it kind of assumed what it was trying to prove by assuming, the Protestant canon and saying that First and Second Maccabees had no relevance whatsoever. Anyway, I made that status, um, and I think it's on July 19th. I actually made a video response to Dorpatan earlier that night. It's still up, by the way. And uh, uh, a Catholic Facebook friend of mine who was known on YouTube as Theological37. I don't know where he is now, but his name was Joseph. He invited me to a chat, also with another guy called Russell Baldocci, and I have no idea where he is now. I heard wind that he might have apostatized, but that's just a rumor. Please don't take it as authoritative. I have no idea. Um, I probably shouldn't even mention that rumor because I don't know if it's true. Anyway, so I had this conversation with him, and he kind of presented to me um, the Catholic view of the history of the church, um, and presented to me a whole series of arguments for Catholicism. Now, I don't want to romanticize kind of my conversion and reshape the story to make it look as good as possible for me, because I have to be absolutely clear that my conversion to Orthodoxy was really not principally an intellectual matter. I don't want to paint the story as if I carefully researched a whole set of arguments and decided to convert to Orthodoxy after profound study, because that's just not true. Um, but what I was convinced of by the end of that night, and it was a conversation that lasted several hours, I remember the sun coming up. Uh, what I was convinced of is that Catholicism clearly had much more historical grounding than did any form of Protestantism. In other words, that no form of Protestantism would have been in any way recognizable to the fathers of the church up through the medievals. And so, honestly, I know this is really quick, and I should have done more study on it. I just consider this God's providence, because at this point, I am wholly intellectually convinced of orthodoxy and will happily make intellectual arguments that I think are perfectly sound. But I should say at this point, I probably should have done more study just in terms of intellectual virtue. But I felt compelled to become a Catholic. And by the way, as far as that conclusion goes, I still stand completely by it. I know that there are a lot of Protestant and Reformed scholars who are who try to draw out links between Protestant theology and medieval and the medieval and patristic age. But the fact is, even in the earliest magisterial Reformation, Protestantism looked profoundly different than did the ancient church and the medieval church of East or West. I mean, for heaven's sake, there were no bishops. The doctrine of the apostolic succession of the priesthood was lost quickly. I mean, there were traces of it in the early reformers, but it was lost quickly because no bishops converted in the early Reformation. And so that disappeared. You started to get widely variant views on the Eucharist. Zwinglianism developed very quickly. Of course, Calvin had the view of spiritual presence, which is kind of obscure as to what that actually meant. And Luther had a fairly traditional view of the sacramental union. I mean, Lutherans will say it's not consubstantiation, but the truth is it's basically consubstantiation, though they wouldn't like to use that word. Anyway, my point is that early Protestantism looks very, very different from the church at any point during its history, and the doctrine of justification by imputation is not there in the history of the church. It's just not. And there are lots of attempts to prove that it is. I mean, the fathers use the phrase faith alone, but the fact is the doctrine of sola fide, or faith alone, is just a shorthand. It's a shorthand for an entire theological system, which is not present in the fathers. I mean, there is an Orthodox way of interpreting the phrase faith alone, in the sense that faith alone denotes the manner of our relationship with God, because it is faith alone which qualifies the relationship of a son to his father, which is why it is the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah which weaves the life of the eternal Son into the life of humanity, thus making us sons. But anyway, I can't go into huge detail on that now, but I still very much stand by that conclusion. Despite particular issues some people will have with one part of it. I mean, there were some controversies about the Eucharist, but they were fairly local. And the fact is, Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Assyrian Church of the East all hold the same Eucharistic doctrine, despite having been separated for centuries. And James White will say things, and it amazes me that he says this. He says, if a doctrine like this was present in the early church, then the logical consequences of it, like taking the host out and worshiping the host, would have been manifested. And that they weren't means that this doctrine wasn't present. Well, that's crazy, because the fact is the only church which does that as a regular practice is the Roman Catholic Church, even though all the Eastern churches hold the same doctrine. I'm not necessarily criticizing that practice, by the way. I'm undecided as to it. But what I'm saying is that James White, that it reflects an ignorance of Eastern theology. Anyway, I went on too long about that particular point. Anyway, so this was kind of where I felt compelled on that night to become a Catholic. And I talked to my Orthodox friend about this. I thought he would be happy. He wasn't really. And I was surprised about that. So he told me about Orthodoxy and explained some of their distinctives. And really, I didn't know what I was going to do. Now, here's basically how the story went from this point on. I watched a Catholic video, defending the Catholic doctrine of justification. And at the beginning of the video was a long list of mortal sins. Orthodox, by the way, also have a teaching on mortal sin, though it's not as sharp as the Catholic teaching. Because for Catholics, mortal sins are the kinds of sins you have to say in confession. It's good to confess venial sins, but you have to confess the mortal ones to be forgiven. I would say that Orthodoxy kind of has a different approach to that, in that in confession we just confess everything, and there our priest gives us advice, and then we are forgiven. But this is part of one process of repentance. And so if you repent, you're forgiven. And part of repentance is that as soon as you have access to confession, you also confess. Whereas in the Catholic teaching, I would say that there is this concept of confession or baptism of intent. So if you die before formal confession, you can still be saved. But there's a kind of sharper distinction between venial and mortal sins and how that relates to confession. But anyway, I watched this video and I listened to the list of mortal sins. And it was, all sorts of stuff is mortal sin that we generally don't think of as that serious. Outbursts of rage is a mortal sin. Not going to church is a mortal sin. And I'm not necessarily criticizing the identification of those things as mortal sins, but it depressed me because I really realized at that point how bad of a person I was. I wept bitterly for days, I think for about a week and a half. And I was so depressed over this. And I know, the best of Catholic theology is not legalistic. However, there is a real kind of legalism in Catholicism, especially before Vatican II, but it's still here. For example, the concept that you can knock off a particular amount of time in purgatory by doing a particular prayer, and the papacy can grant you an indulgence, thus absolving you of this time in purgatory. Whereas Orthodox would say our time in purgatory, or the middle state, time of purification, whatever you would want to call it, is due to an ontological condition of our souls, so that someone cannot just absolve you by fiat. It's about your soul being cleansed. And that legalism that is present in Catholic theology, even though the best aspect of Catholic theology, kind of our intention with that broke me up. I felt like it was certainly going to go to hell. And I remember I was sitting in the car. I think my mom was dropping someone off at the Y, but I was in the parking lot of the YMCA. And it was morning, early morning, and I looked up, and I know this is like the least intellectual thing one would expect, but I looked up at the sun, and I just felt utterly compelled to convert to Orthodoxy. And then my stress disappeared. Now, people would say, well, that's not a very good reason. Well, it's not really a reason. It's just kind of a compulsion. And that compulsion I regard as the pricking of the Spirit. And I can happily make apologetic arguments for Orthodoxy at this point. I couldn't really make a good one at that point. But I just felt absolutely compelled to become Orthodox. And so my decision was firm at that point. I read some Catholic apologetics on the papacy. The early ones, especially the stuff that's still up on Catholic.com, I think it is absolutely shameful, by the way, that they have St. Cyprian quotations from On the Unity of the Church. And they present them as if he's talking about the Pope. Because whatever you want to argue about Cyprian's broader theology, as might be reflected in his other letters, there's no question whatsoever that in the unity of the Church, the chair of Peter is the chair of every bishop. And why this is still being presented as if it is talking about the papacy, I have no idea. This terrible, terrible research. Again, there are arguments that can be made from Cyprian's other letters, but not unity of the Church. So I learned about that stuff and those kind of misrepresentations, and I was kind of firmed up in my Orthodox convictions. Some of the two earliest books I think I read on this were Clark Carlton. He has a pretty good series on Orthodoxy. He has a book called The Truth, The Orthodox Approach to Roman Catholicism. And then, what's the other one? I think it might be The Life, which is his response to Protestantism. So I read both of those. I don't agree with everything in them at this point. For example, I would take a kind of more open view towards Catholicism. I still believe Orthodoxy is the true church, but I don't think the sharp, rigorous, and I'm not using that word in a polemical sense, I don't think the sharp, rigorous view is justified historically. And I also don't think that his critiques of Roman Catholic Mariology are justified, especially that the co-redemptrix doctrine, when understood properly, is harmless. It just says that Mary participates in the redemptive work of Christ for our sake, which is just what St. Paul says about the church in general, and Mary is the supreme embodiment of the church. So we all are co-redemption in that sense. I don't really know why one would define it as a separate doctrine. That just seems to incite confusion, but I don't think that in itself is idolatry, but he has a big problem with it. Anyway, so I read these books, and, as someone at 16 years old and an arrogant person is inclined to do, I immediately started arguing on the internet. Now, this is such a stupid thing to do, right? For someone who's just moving into Orthodoxy, not even a month, to start arguing in a condescending way towards Protestants. I was a freaking Protestant a month before. I mean, it was crazy that I would do this, but, that was me. So I did it, and I remember, because I had a particular interest in debating Protestants, I remember looking at Romans 3 and reading that text, and I had no clue what it meant. I don't know if I'd ever paid attention to it as a Protestant, by the way. I didn't know what justified meant. I mean, this is how biblically illiterate I was. And I remember looking through those verses and saying, what in the world does this mean? And that memory of looking at the text on my Action Bible program and having no idea what it meant is very vivid. It's a very vivid memory. Nevertheless, I argued. Of course, I proof texted James 2:24, which I still think is a valid argument, but I mean, I didn't really know how to argue it well. I just kind of quoted James 2:24 and was done with it, which is no better than the Protestant quoting Romans 3:28 or Ephesians 2:8-10 and being done with it. That's what I do. But, in a sense, I do think that this was providential, because beginning to work on the Bible just in order to argue with Protestants set me on a path which I still walk today. And I'll talk about that a little bit in this video. So that's where I was. You guys probably remember me at that point. You probably perceive me in that point, same way I perceive myself in hindsight, or worse, who knows. But that's where I was. And I started going to an Orthodox church every Sunday. It was a catechumen. I went first time in, I think it was August 21st, maybe a little later in the month. I think it was last Sunday of August, might be the second to last. It was actually the bishop was there, so that was interesting for my first liturgy, seeing a bishop celebrate. And so I started the path to conversion. I kept making videos on YouTube. At first, I was very, very ecumenical and open. I didn't really know how to formulate this stuff, so I would say that the church, Orthodox Church, is the true church, but people can be saved outside of it. But now I would say people are always saved by participation in the church, so that participation might be imperfect. But I moved fairly quickly to a highly rigorous view of other Christians. And the reason I did so is because it seemed to me that the only people who were making serious arguments from the fathers were rigorists, were people who said, outside the Orthodox Church, there is no ecclesiality. In other words, baptism by a Protestant or a Catholic is just getting dunked. Roman Catholic Eucharist is just bread and wine. And it seemed to me that these were the only people who were seriously talking about the fathers. While other people would make arguments saying, well, that's a nasty point of view, or you're just a fundamentalist. And that kind of sloganizing is total bull, and I really dislike it. And people who do it should stop, because it doesn't work. Because I was interested in following the tradition. I have a different view today, but my different view is still rooted in the tradition of the church. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But even St. Mark of Ephesus, and by the way, St. Mark of Ephesus was not the person that many Catholics and many Orthodox perceive him to be. He was actually a very subtle theologian who addressed the Pope as the most blessed Father, who forbade the rebaptism of Catholics after the Council of Florence. And by the way, for people who want to say that reception by chrismation is oikonomia, that's impossible, because the definition of economia is loosening the canons. But the prohibition on rebaptism is in the canons. That is acrivia. That is strictness, because it's in the canons. So there needs to be a different argument than the economia one. Anyway, So I held a very strict view, but I was also an asshole about it. And there are Orthodox saints who hold a very strict, rigorous view who are filled with love and kindness. So I don't think it's just about being mean, but I was mean about it. And I remember I was pushy with my mother, which, you know, was terrible. I mean, this is one of the things the saints say, don't be pushy with your family. But I was at that point, and I stopped eventually because it wasn't working. Um, and I made silly videos on YouTube that I shouldn't have been making, especially not while a catechumen. At least while someone's a catechumen, they shouldn't be arguing on the internet. But as I said, the process of arguing in a way did help me, because getting crushed in argument after argument is a good way of learning that you need to do your homework before getting into an argument. So I was received by chrismation into the Orthodox, or I'm sorry, actually I was received by baptism. In hindsight, yeah, I actually kind of, my priest said, if you can't find your baptismal certificate, then we'll just baptize you. And I didn't even look for it. I said, oh, I didn't find it. In hindsight, I would not have done that, but I actually am glad that I received the prayers associated with the baptism. But I was chrismated on March 28th, 2010, under the name Seraphim, because Saint Seraphim of Sarov really touched my heart, and as soon as I listened to his life, I knew that I was going to take the name Seraphim. And listening to the lives of the saints was amazing for me, because I learned what holiness really looked like, what it meant to be united deeply with God, and what great calling we were called to. And also during this period, having the church say things definitively that I couldn't just get around, like, this is what humility looks like. Obviously, I wasn't being humble, and I had to actually deal with that. Or, you have to go to church. You can't make excuses for not going to church. And I couldn't get around that, so I started going to church. That was very important, to actually participate in sanctification, realizing that, yeah, you're a sinner, you can't make excuses for it. So I became Orthodox in 2010. During the next year or so, I kept arguing with Protestants badly. I remember reading N.T. Wright's book on justification. No clue what it meant, but I would wave it around and say, hey, look, N.T. Wright agrees with the Orthodox perspective, which he doesn't. I think he's helpful in some ways to it, but he definitely does not agree with the Orthodox perspective on justification, which is that justification is theosis. Michael Gorman is a good guy to read. Inhabiting the Cruciform God, great book. That is the Orthodox view of justification. Anyway, I did my senior thesis in high school on the Orthodox doctrine of salvation in Scripture. I started to learn things. Certain things started to get a little less blurry for me at this point. But in hindsight, it's not a thesis I would share today. I mean, it still was pretty poor by standards I regard as good exegesis today. And an informed Protestant would have taken it apart. But things started to get a little less blurry for me. Graduated high school. I went to Africa in 2012, early 2012. Then I went to another place to actually meet the guy who introduced me to Orthodoxy. And that was good, actually meeting him and working through this stuff in person and going to a monastery for part of Holy Week. That was really good. And also at this point, things started to sharpen up more clearly. Now, early in that year, I was very anti-Roman Catholic, and I said very stupid things about Roman Catholicism. Very, very, very stupid things. Of course, at this point, I still held that the principal problem with Roman Catholicism was the Anselmian doctrine of atonement. By the way, Anselm did not teach penal substitution. There is a difference between the satisfaction theory and penal substitution. Stop saying Anselm taught penal substitution. Also, Anselm did not invent his doctrine out of full cloth. There are strong precedents in earlier Latin theology. Well, the problem that I discovered with this approach, which is the core of a lot of Orthodox anti-Western apologetics today, is that it's not actually something the Orthodox saints talked about. You read St. Gregory Palamas, you read St. Photius, you read St. Mark of Ephesus, they do not critique Rome on the grounds that they have a different doctrine of atonement than us. I think that the doctrine of satisfaction simply is the Orthodox doctrine of justification by divinization in other language. One might disagree with me on that, but what one can't really disagree on is that this is not a central point. Also at this time, I had a talk with Theologica 37, who was the person to introduce me to Catholicism/Orthodoxy, and we talked about original sin, and he said, "You're not representing the Catholic doctrine of original sin correctly. It is not imputed guilt we receive from Adam, but simply the privation of sanctifying grace," which is, in fact, what Orthodox teach. And so by April of 2012, I was starting to shift my perspective on Roman Catholicism because I'd been so badly smashed and embarrassed by a Roman Catholic on my Facebook because I wrote an article about Roman Catholicism. And I deleted him kind of out of embarrassment, but I later re-added him. So I had to kind of start dealing more honestly with Roman Catholicism at this point. And I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but I hope you get something out of it. Anyway, by April of 2012, or I would say it's actually by May of 2012, I abandoned the idea that Anselm's doctrine of satisfaction or Roman Catholic doctrine of original sin is really a big issue between Orthodox and Roman Catholicism. You read any Orthodox confession or catechism prior to John Romanides, you will find they talk about original sin. Original sin is an Orthodox teaching. It is not the same as the Reformed doctrine of original sin, but I don't really see any major substantial difference between the Roman Catholic teaching and the Orthodox teaching. Most of the argument for a substantial difference hinges on the word reatus at the Council of Trent, supposing that to mean imputed guilt, but actually most Latin scholars and scholars of the Council of Trent would say that's not what Rome meant. So doctrine of original sin, it just means the absence of sanctifying grace which was given to Adam at his creation, and it's given back to us in baptism, which is why we baptize infants. St. Augustine is a father of the Orthodox Church. We agree with him over and against Pelagius. Pelagius' heresy was the denial of original sin, basically saying that the only difference between us and Adam is that we're born into a sinful world, which means we're tempted by these external inclinations, whereas the Orthodox and Catholic teaching is that original sin is an internal corruption, which is inherited from Adam. Anyway, so I started to deal with that more honestly, and I began to kind of read and listen to Robertson Genes's work on justification. Robertson Genes has written some very interesting things on justification. I definitely don't agree with everything that he says or all of his approach, but I think his estimation of Paul's theology is fairly close to the mark, though in some texts I would get there in a different way than he does. And so for the first time, I would say around mid-2012, the biblical text began to sharpen up for me, and I began to actually be able to work through it and understand it. I also was reading N.T. Wright at this point in time. I read his book, New Testament and the People of God, and what he said in that book is the family of Abraham, in Jewish understanding, is a renewed family of Adam. And that insight has been very important for me ever since, and it has continued to bear fruit. And I have found it's not just ancient Jewish understanding, it is definitely the Old Testament understanding. Check out Seth Postel's book, Adam is Israel, for a great exegesis of Genesis 2-3 in this light. I would prefer that he said Israel is Adam, because I think Adam was a historical person, and Israel's history really typologically corresponded to it, not just that the biblical authors molded the text to correspond to it. But that's a topic maybe for my next video. So things started to sharpen up. I started a blog called St. Justin the Philosopher Foundation for Orthodox Christian Apologetics on Facebook. It's not my blog now, but I put out some of my stuff there. Some of that material I still regard as fairly good quality, though I would revise it these days. Sorry, it's just an apple. So things were sharpening up at this point. That fall, I went to Calvin College for my freshman year, so fall of 2012, spring of 2013. I later transferred, but I'll get to that in my next video. There were two other people there who converted to Orthodoxy while I was at Calvin, so they were my close friends. And I started to kind of get into the Bible more. And this is the point where I would say I began to get into the Bible for its own sake. Because I actually found that this was an awesome, interesting book. And it had all sorts of threads that ran from Genesis to Revelation. I didn't have a great understanding of them at this point, but the Bible began to interest me for its own sake, not just as an apologetic tool against Protestants, or as an historical source book against non-Christians. Um, so that was a kind of big transition for me. Uh, and in 2013, during Lent, I would say that I had my second major crisis of faith. It wasn't as major as the one I'd had in 2006 and 2007, but it was pretty serious. From the period from 2008, or late 2007 rather, to 2012, doubt was a nagging presence in my life. It didn't ever go away fully, but it wasn't that serious enough that it caused me major distress. In 2013, it caused me major distress. So in late 2012, I began to kind of get into evolution again. I didn't post anything about it, but I would watch videos about it. I kind of got into the whole science thing. And by the way, I still love science. I think it's super fascinating. But I was much more trusting of the scientific community, quote unquote, at that point in time. And I found the naturalistic worldview much more intuitively compelling than I do now. At first glance, when you look at science, it's easy to think that naturalism is intrinsically associated with it. And if you're convinced of evolution, as I definitely was, note the tense there, then it's easy to find naturalism intuitively compelling. I do remember in 2013, I didn't know any philosophy, but I remember in 2013, just sitting in my bed, thinking, and it came to me in a moment, the problem of consciousness. Because I thought, why am I actually conscious? Because evolution and naturalism could explain why I behaved the way that I did. In other words, my brain was just generating certain actions. It could explain why I would look conscious to an external observer, but it didn't explain why I actually was conscious. Why am I actually able to perceive things? Why do I have qualia, is the technical term. And I thought that was, I remember thinking on that, I thought, I don't see a solution for that. And there isn't a solution, by the way, within naturalism. There are very bad attempts at it. And I also kind of got interested in the argument from contingency at this point. That was another one that was very compelling to me. But I was struggling seriously with the crisis of faith during Lent. And so was my best friend, who was the guy who introduced me to Orthodox. We became best friends when I was visiting him in 2012. So he was also struggling majorly with it. And I didn't tell anybody that I was struggling, but I was, very seriously. But I kept going to church. I kept saying my prayers. And on Pascha, May 5th of 2015, it went away. And that was my last major crisis of faith. So my next video is going to be on late 2013 to probably the present. I might split that into a couple videos, but I think it'll be one video. Anyway, thanks for listening. Hope you found it somewhat interesting or helpful.